In this lecture, I'd like to share with you some research that my colleague and one of our graduate students did a number of years ago, looking at how mock jurors determine death and how they come up with their sentence. Now, before we can talk about that research and what they did, let's talk a little bit about capital trials. Okay. First of all, in order to serve on a capital trial, potential jurors must be unopposed to enforcing the death penalty. And so they go through a process of what's called death qualification. Um, and this is the process through which attorneys determine whether members of the venire, the people who are being chosen for the jury, whether they are qualified to serve on a death penalty case. In other words, if you're going to be asked to possibly sentence someone to death, you have to be willing to do so. You cannot have scruples that keep you from voting for death on a capital trial. So we have then jurors that are specially selected, and they're very different possibly from your typical juror. Before we talk about death qualified jurors, let's just talk a little bit about the law. Now, there are three big Supreme Court cases that kind of established who can serve on a capital case. The first is Witherspoon versus Illinois, and this was a 1968 case. The Supreme Court ruled that you can only strike a juror if they explicitly state their opposition to the death penalty. So they say that they would automatically vote against death no matter what kind of evidence you presented. If I said this, what would you say? I wouldn't say death. What if I said that? What if I said, nope, 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 nope. And that's the Witherspoon criteria. A little bit later, the criteria was loosened up even more. The Supreme Court ruled that just simply having scruples against the death penalty could hamper your ability to follow the law. So it's not the case that you have to explicitly say, I absolutely will not do this. But if you have scruples, and your scruples are such that you might not be able to follow the law, you could be removed. So basically what they're saying is you don't have to automatically vote against the death penalty in order to be excluded. Instead, just simply having difficulty following the law because of your scruples could strike you from being a juror. So a little bit of a loosened criteria. And then finally, the final case that's very important, it was in Morgan versus Illinois in 1992. And basically what the Supreme Court said was that potential jurors who will always give the death penalty, they're called automatic death penalty jurors, must also be excluded. Basically, they need to be excluded so that you don't violate the due process clause of the Constitution. The defendant has the right to have jurors that would be willing to listen to evidence that would give them a life sentence rather than a death sentence. So those are the three criteria that are being used in the courts today. Now, what do we know about jurors who meet these criteria? Are they different from other types of jurors? And the answer is a resounding yes. Okay? There is a ton of research on these jurors and how they differ from just a random selection of jurors. So the research that's usually done here is you compare a group of death qualified jurors, okay, with a group of random jurors. You don't want to pick jurors that are excluded. You want to pick random because that would be your typical jury pool. How do they differ from just the random sample of the population? First and foremost, they're more conviction prone. The research has shown that they are more likely to convict the defendant, even in non-capital cases. So there's been a ton of research just looking at jurors who are death qualified versus just a random sample, and then just giving them a burglary or an assault or any kind of case. What you find is that death qualified jurors are more prone to conviction. Also, studies have shown that they don't deliberate as thoroughly. And that's probably because if you get a group of people who are death qualified, they already start out with fewer mixed opinions. And they probably likely agree on a lot of the big issues in a case because they are chosen because of their prior sort of beliefs and views of the world. So you get like-minded people together, then you might see that there isn't as much deliberation. it would be interesting, I don't think anybody's ever done this, is to go ahead and look at another group of people who might be like-minded and put them together and have them deliberate. So like jurors who are what we call not death qualified because they refuse to give the death penalty. Do they also not deliberate as thoroughly? And my guess would be yes, because they're so like-minded. Well, there was a ton of research that showed that death qualified jurors were different, and they do seem to be biased against the defendant. And in 1986, there was a court case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And there was enough data about death qualified jurors and their biases that the American Psychological Association offered an amicus brief in that case. And what they did was they presented all the evidence that showed that death qualified jurors were biased. And the court basically rejected the amicus brief. And when I say rejected, they just basically, in their decision, they said that there seemed to be research findings that in general, death qualified jurors are biased. However, they said it didn't prove that the jury in this case was biased. And in fact, what they said was that if a jury or a jury member says that they're going to be impartial, we have to take them at their word. And they basically said it would be impossible to have a perfect jury. So what they're basically saying is we reject the amicus brief and the principles in the amicus brief. Now, I think it's kind of interesting, this particular decision. I don't think that they could have come up with a different decision, because had they decided that death qualified jurors were too biased to actually give you an unbiased verdict, just think about the upheaval that would have caused in this country. Basically, every single trial that had death qualified jurors could be now appealed. So I think the Supreme Court was probably being practical at that time. They're basically saying, yes, this is a problem, and no, there's nothing we're going to do about it. Okay, so now we still have this death qualification process. The interesting thing about the process, though, is that there are some standard questions that are asked. And they're not asked like this, but this is the way we do it in the research. But what you see is the way that the questions are asked in the courtroom, they're simply asked as a yes-no question. They're kind of cut and dry. They're either or nature. So here's the first one. Oh, it should say, is your attitude? Is your attitude toward the death penalty so strong that it would seriously affect you as a juror and interfere with your ability to perform your duties? That would be the Wainwright standard, right? So it's your attitude would affect your ability to perform your duties. Second one, if you would vote, obviously you're supposed to say no in order to be qualified. If you would vote for the death penalty in at least some cases, is your attitude toward the death penalty such that as a juror you would always vote for the death penalty in every case in which you were sure beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant was guilty of first-degree murder? So in other words, if you are completely sure that the person is guilty, would you always choose the death penalty? And of course, this is the Morgan versus Illinois standard. This is the automatic death penalty jurors. And then finally, that even if you thought the defendant was guilty of capital murder, that you would find them not guilty in order to avoid the possibility of them being sentenced to death. And that, of course, is the Witherspoon standard. And what you find is that, of course, in order to be death qualified, you'd have to say no to the first question. Would you automatically vote? That should be no. And then the final question should be no. Okay. When they come for a capital case, they're asked these kinds of questions, and based on their responses, they are either kept or excluded. And they're challenged for cause. So this is not a peremptory challenge. Remember, we talked way early in the class about how attorneys have certain peremptory challenges. This is a challenge for cause. There's no limit to the number of jurors that you can exclude who are not death qualified. So this whole background then takes me to the work that I just want to share with you today. And this was done by Chrissy Adams. She was a graduate student in our program, and Marty Bourgeois, who was a faculty member in our program in the psychology and law program. And what Chrissy was interested in is she felt that the way that jurors were death qualified with those standard questions, yes, no, were not really, they were okay, I guess, but she felt that she could do better. And so what she did was she developed a scale to kind of look at death qualification in a more nuanced way rather than those simple black and white questions. So in the first study I'm going to tell you about, this is 59 undergraduates, about average age about 22 years. These were all UW students. And what she did was then she gave everybody the standard questions to divide the students into 3 groups. So based on those questions I showed you in the slide before, 37 of the students were death qualified. 9 of the students were non-death qualified in the sense that they said that they could not follow the law. They were against the death penalty. And then the last group of 13 said that they would always give the death penalty, regardless. Once they found the person guilty, they would always give the death penalty. So what Chrissy did was she devised a scale that had 9 really short sentences, little scenarios. Like 9 scenarios presented different kinds of crimes and asking people if they were absolutely certain, beyond a reasonable doubt, that somebody committed this crime, what is the likelihood that they would award the death penalty? From 1, which is definitely not, to 7, absolutely. So let me show you the DPAS questions. I put them in order of severity, but obviously she gave them in a random order. So the one that was the least severe was a battered wife kills her husband as he sleeps, killing a spouse in jealous rage, killing an unarmed person who trespasses, killing a bank clerk while robbing a bank, getting into a bar fight, go home, get a weapon, and kill the victim, kill a police officer after being stopped for a routine traffic violation. By the way, she piloted these and asked people to rate the severity of the crime, and this is the order in which they gave them in terms of which had the most severe ratings. Killed a spouse to receive insurance money, killed multiple random victims, and then the most severe was sexually molesting and killing a child. So what Chrissy then did was she gave the DPAS questions to these students, to these 59 students, and asked them to rate the likelihood that they would give the death penalty. And here are her hypotheses. Here's what she was thinking. Basically, that death qualified jurors, those were the ones that death qualified based on the standard questions, would be significantly more likely to give the death penalty across the 9 situations, which would make sense, right? If the DPAS, if the scale is any good at all, the death qualified jurors should be more likely to give the death penalty across all situations. Also, she expected that the automatic death penalty jurors would be more likely than any of the other 2 groups to give the death penalty, which makes sense again. But importantly, this was the piece that she was really most interested in, was that there are situations where non-death qualified jurors would still be willing to give the death penalty, and there might be situations in which these automatic death penalty people would not be willing to give the death penalty, okay? Which is kind of violating what they say in those simple questions. So let's take a look at what she found. First of all, I just want to show you, as you might expect and what you would hope, this is the DPAS score, so the death penalty attitude score. As you would hope and expect, is that the non-death qualified jurors got much lower scores than the death qualified, and then the automatic folks got the highest score. However, I just want to point something out to you right here. As you look at these scores, what do you see? What doesn't fit? As they might say, something does not belong here. Think about what this scale is. There are 9 items, and 7 means that you would give the death penalty absolutely. 9 times 7 is 63. So that's the highest score that you can receive on the scale. Look at the automatic death penalty people. What should their score be if they're telling the truth? That they would always give the death penalty. Yeah, their score should be 63. What about the folks that say they wouldn't give the death penalty? There are 9 items here. And if they said a 1 on each of these, what should their score be? I think you can see right away that some of what Chrissy suspected is true. What people say sort of in the abstract may not be exactly what they would do when given an actual kind of scenario. Let's take a look at the two extremes here. Here was the one where the battered wife kills a husband while he was sleeping. And here are the scores. Here's the distribution of scores here for that particular scenario. What you find is what? Basically, if you go over here, this is yes, absolutely, I would give the death penalty. There were two people, maybe three, two people actually, who said that yes, absolutely, I would give the death penalty. But I don't know if you remember this, there were actually 9 people in the automatic death qualified group. These are the people who said they would always give the death penalty. And here you have, in the one section, you have 19 people who said they would not, okay? Which again is more than the non-death qualified number, but certainly some people might have felt that that was not a good verdict or a good sentence. But I think the most important group is right here. Why are not all 9 of them there? Well, because once they're given a scenario, they're like, well, maybe not in this case. Now let me give you the other extreme. This is a person who sexually molests and kills a child. Remember, there were 9 non-death qualified jurors who said they wouldn't give the death penalty. What happened to them? Okay, there's one person who stuck to their moral conviction and said, no, I can't give the death penalty, even for this. Obviously, the other 8 changed their minds, and they didn't even choose 2s or 3s. They were up here. And in fact, if you look at the people who said yes, the death penalty, 42 of the participants said yes, absolutely, I'd give the death penalty. So you see, using the standard ways of dividing people wasn't really very helpful. And in fact, depending on the case, people who said they would always give the death penalty sometimes didn't. And people who said they would never give the death penalty sometimes did. Okay. So what Chrissy did was she then took this initial study and she gave them, she did another study where she looked at whether or not the DPAS, her scale, predicted verdict and sentencing, whether it was useful. And basically, she gave, this was a completely different sample, and they were given a trial, a capital trial. It was a short trial, and they were asked to, first of all, determine the verdict at the trial, and then they went into a sentencing phase, and they were asked to give a sentence. What she found was the DPAS did significantly predict verdict. As you can see, that those who scored higher on the DPAS were more likely to vote guilty than not guilty in this case, which suggests, again, like the death qualification, you're picking people who are more conviction prone, okay, overall. Importantly, though, was the sentence. And what she found was that the DPAS also predicted sentence. That the higher your DPAS score, the more likely you were to give a death sentence rather than a life sentence. Okay, so I just wanted to share with you this research. I think it's interesting because this has not been followed up very much, but it's certainly something that could be followed up because we still use the old way of doing things. But I think Chrissy's work suggests that there may be better ways to pick people for capital trials.